The Sleepers, Chapter 14, Connections. When Karl died during my sophomore year, I voted against returning home. Funerals were not my thing. Too much wasted emotion. It was Lucius that at last convinced me to go, giving a closed-eyed speech about attendance being the right thing to do. When the wizard commanded, I might protest, but I'd eventually relent. It's not that I absolutely hated funerals, or that I didn't want to honor Karl. I just felt there was no place for us at the so-called celebration. Karl spent his life collecting people, only the most interesting characters and misfits. Like a hunter collected trophies. Take away the hunter, and we didn't belong, nor would anyone want us. We hadn't known each other before Karl. We certainly wouldn't be friends after his death. My relationship with Karl was mine alone, a private friendship. I wouldn't ruin it with an awkward eulogy by one of his odd friendships, or worse, my father. But I went at Lucius's prodding. Karl had pre-selected me as a pallbearer. In fact, he planned every detail of the affair, putting aside all the necessary funds and lining out every nuance so no one would feel put upon, or screw it up. Speakers had apparently been asked years in advance, with contingencies and updates for unintended deaths. The music was a medley of depressing Beatles songs, almost as bad as any dirge. Cremation, the traditional path for sleepers, meant the pallbearer title was honorific only. He wanted to end his existence as a true sleeper. Besides, as a single man, Karl had no grand illusions that loved ones would be visiting his grave. Oh, he'd want it. He'd want you to visit, tell a good anecdote, share a homemade pizza, and give some gossip. But he was realistic. Without the need to move any casket, I sat between my parents, listening to the eulogy delivered by a mysterious old business partner. No tears came. I was a rock, stuck watching the minutes tick by. The will reading changed it all. Karl's lawyer privately invited a handful of funeral guests to meet the next day for the will reading. I expected Karl might bequeath me the National Geographic collection out of spite. What would I do with so much paper? His house was donated to a drug rehab program, a final thumbed nose to his neighborhood, cleverly executed to fit within the covenants. Some gray-haired, well-dressed lady I'd never seen or heard of got the magazines. She bawled at the offer. Who was this woman? I'd probably wrapped gifts for everyone in this room at Christmas time and didn't even know these people. Sometimes Karl would spill all, yet other relationships he held dear and private. My mother received his mom's wedding ring. It was a peculiar gift, yet made sense. Karl had no wife, but Susan was his friend and kept him in check. She wore the diamond around her neck on a white gold chain forevermore. John Jr. even encouraged it, beaming as the lawyer read his wife's name. To my father, Karl gave a digital file containing hundreds of brain scans, taken while he lucidly dreamed. That was a true gift to a sleep scientist, even one promoted way beyond research. I never learned what my father did with those scans. They were just his piece of Karl. The reading continued. There were coins from around the world, a wine collection, and his strange knickknacks, but very few paintings. The bulk of furnishings and impersonal items were left for the estate sale and ultimate donation. At last it came to me. He would make me wait. He would have me observe every detail of the sequence and choices. Just another practice. I felt like counting my fingers and accidentally leaving the middle one up just to get a rise out of him. My inheritance was shocking. His entire personal collection of painted dream renderings and a few of my favorite rocks. It was the gift of kings, a gift he would only bestow on his protege and friend. A curmudgeon to the end, his succinct annotation in the will read, "John, may all your dreams come true. K.S." He threw in all of his brushes and remaining paint tubes for good measure. I'd carried those devices over many jumbled rocks. Now they were mine. He seemed to be saying, "Don't forget to paint as you chase those dreams." My mother looked at me stunned. My father seemed to frown. The other attendees had the full gamut of facial expressions, but they all reflected one question. Who was this kid? The weight of his gift started to crush me like the painted boulders. The whole funeral, the will reading, it had just been a recorded moment in my history, part of life. Now it was real, and the tears came. Karl was my friend, not Ray, not my father. Karl was my friend, and now I carried his legacy, or rather it would hang on the walls of my home someday, and always on the walls of my heart. Chapter 15. The Skipping Rock. Ray never surrendered. Everything about him made him lovable and boring. He was every mother's dream. But that is just not good enough. My father once articulated an allegory to describe love, especially as it applied to Ray Matson. I witnessed the prophetic fruition in college as I watched Ray's crashes and recoveries. John Jr. said that Ray moved between girls like a rock skipped on a pond, each splash encountering waves from the previous, yet still skipping. The sport of skipping rocks is purposefully individualistic and ponderous. Meticulously, the caster first selects the perfect skipping rock. It is well polished, then well aimed, and ultimately well flicked. Upon hurling the rock over the water, the caster's job is essentially done. He will watch and count skips. The adventure is bestowed upon the rock, whose new home is in the hands of fate. Touching down like a rug burn, the rock ricochets violently with the first connection. Wreckage spirals mark the path of carnage. Bounce. New circling waves collide with memories of the last splash. Interference patterns weave one complete story. Bounce again. Microscopic abrasions and imperfections alter each subsequent trajectory. Bounce. Bounce. The original vector is but a starting point. The rock and water determine final destination. With each consecutive bounce, the rock's velocity declines. Momentum transfers to the vampire-like water, giving life to waves at the expense of the rock. The distance between contacts rapidly disintegrates. Collisions and ensuing waves become less frequent and less severe. The ability to accurately predict the rock's final plunge increases. Finally, when lateral momentum cannot overcome gravity and friction, the rock's journey according to the caster is over. The count is scored, and a new rock divined. But to the rock, a new life begins, one that is unknown and unseen to the living, the life of marriage and monogamy. Ray was the consummate skipping rock. To the caster, Ray was a turtle rock, well-formed smooth shell with an unpredictable underbelly. He was eagerly selected for the cast, sartorial in the eyes of his rocky associates, assuming shell side faced up. Yet, when handled, the caster's textural sensors alarmed to the ridges, troughs, and pits, scarring his undersurface. Too appealing on top for the caster to surrender, the rock is teleported to its future regardless of the neural alerts. The round nature and smooth top provide many bounces, but coarse components mold Ray's erratic journey. Exact prediction is impossible. Perhaps what made watching Ray's disaster so joyful was the size of the crash and the speed of the rebound. A full delineation of Ray's exploits, more often defeats, would be exhaustively boring and off-topic, but a summary is noteworthy. Mothers might have loved Ray, but daughters required more convincing. No matter the adjective, selfish, reserved, energetic, pragmatic, sophisticated, bucolic, no matter the status click, neo-Gothic, artist, cheerleader, nerd, sleep slut. In fact, no matter what line of demarcation criterion, women did not like Ray. At least never in a manner that was mutually beneficial. Stellar alignments occurred more frequently than Ray found a woman commensurately interested in him. The first women were polar extremes, frenzied jumps in an ocean of possibility. Ray publicly projected his disoriented state of attention by the myriad of women he dated. There was Jennifer, strong-willed and opinionated, tastefully flirtatious, but only with Ray's friends. There was Leslie, extremely attentive and engaging, especially with her boyfriend who tagged along for Ray's first date. And Nicole, pleasant, appealing, platonic, no further explanation necessary. And of course, Haley. Honest and nostalgically long-loved, Ray was her first and possibly last date by her own choice. The list could go on ad infinitum and ad nauseum. Despite his naivete, Ray did possess a recognizable intellect, so he wisely learned from the explosive crashes of youth seeking more compatible contestants in later years. The women became more entangled, and the feminine lies became more elaborate. The maturity of women matches an ability to end a relationship with finesse. As the rock approaches the final plunge, the universe breathes slowly. Bounce, breathe, bounce, pause, bounce, and plunge. That's the risk of the final bounces. One will bury the rock to the fates. Thus women know a man who approaches their type. They possess a special alertness designed to stop the 90% man. The 90% man is one most nearly right. Retrospectively, though it would be sacrilege to say it, these men are probably perfect for their final skips, but women must resist. It is the nature of the skipped. So the intrigue matures and deceit blossoms. The woman calls delay of game to hinder the plunge. Roadblocks are swiftly constructed and destroyed, and every petty necessary deed is done to prevent this 90% Don Juan from being the full centurion. As we ticked off years of studies, Ray's bounce pattern became ever more predictable, the ripples consecutively softer. Marked by deceit and suffering, these last bounces drained Ray of his determination. Sophia, coy, young, and well-slept, dated Ray and her secret best friend simultaneously. When she dumped Ray, she claimed her poor heart could not love him with due justice, separated as they were at distant universities. Jessica, learned, mature, and unapproachable, dragged Ray through heartache quagmire, unwilling to commit wholeheartedly, following repeated awkward physical interactions. And mixed in the swirling record, most bitter of all, was Samantha. Chapter 16. Fortune Cookies. Ray seemed infatuated with women who would not reciprocate his love. If questioned publicly, Ray would attribute his tenacity in a pseudo-macho gesture, claiming he liked the challenge. If asked privately, he would spout poetry, and with starstruck eyes throw his trust into the quixotic vision of finding true love. I believe he was simply obsessed with losing. The obsession explained his persistence at running school elections. He had learned from schoolwork, not school elections, his parents, and the parents of lovers that he could do no wrong. He learned to believe he was perfect. But in the arena of dating, he was an abysmal failure, for strangely, no obvious reason. Ray's mind couldn't reconcile this imperfection, and so he ignored it. For my own part, when it came to the opposite sex, I simply did not care. Like alcohol and sports, women were yet another distraction from my purpose. I had neither failed, nor tried, to love, nor even gone on a date. If I were going to meet a girl in college, she would have to fall from the sky and have a 100% money-back guarantee. Samantha changed all of this. When Ray first recounted meeting Samantha, a glazed prosaic of delusion marked his face and voice. Ray knew Samantha from childhood, and though he and I were forcibly inseparable at youth, I'd never met her. Whether for reasons of caste or choice, Ray had maintained certain circles through his parents that I had either avoided or simply not penetrated. I prefer to think my unfamiliarity with Samantha was by choice, but given her upbringing and acute, disdainful demeanor, it was likely by design. Ray and Samantha's families were social counterparts. However, a 3-year gap in age precluded any adolescent interest in Samantha. College painted a more attractive age opportunity. We had just returned home from first-year doctoral studies to enjoy a brief summer convalescence. Our master's thesis would be due in December. The thought of love was typically absent from my mind and characteristically omnipresent for Ray's. Any new pasture meant another chance to harvest. Samantha's mother called Ray days into our vacation. It was awkwardly direct, but not extraordinary. Ray narrated his history with Samantha and the arranged date to me one afternoon over steaming hot General Tso's chicken. Despite our obviously strained friendship, Ray and I spent inordinate hours together for extremely polar motives. Ray needed a counselor. I needed a subject. Spending even our holidays together only further fueled the fire for my intrusive mother and her inquisition to understand her son. But I just needed my Chinese food fix. We only ate Chinese food together, a symbol of our shared addiction for MSG. It started freshman year, and we never stopped. The restaurant was empty at 2 p.m., so we had our pick of cheap vinyl booths. The too-large room had the right smell of undesirable seafood and soy sauce. 4 servers gossiped with the cook near the back wall, ignoring our conversation. "Samantha's mom called me!" "Me!" Ray boasted. more excited to talk than eat as usual. I paused my chopstick fury to answer. Odd, but interesting. That was enough to get him started while I devoured heaven on a plate. Ray mimicked the high-class matriarch for his recounting. "This is Cecilia Carlyle, Samantha Carlyle's mother." I told her it was nice to hear her voice and said, "It's been a long time." At this point, I could only hope this was a social call for her daughter and not a random call of etiquette. His chopstick stayed on the plate, freeing his hands for some lively animation of this phone call. I was not about to let my meal cool despite this quality storytelling, so I nodded more while chewing. Then she answered back, telling me it had definitely been too long, and how much of a pleasure it was to hear my voice, and that she had heard I was home for the summer. You see where this is going? Ray raised his eyebrows, fishing for matching enthusiasm from me. I smirked back, but never stopped eating. That was enough for him. A fresh round of hot tea was delivered. Finally, she asked if I had any big plans for the time home. Can you believe it? Anyway, after a few more minutes of updates, she got to the point, saying, and I quote, "I'm calling with regards to my daughter." Good thing she couldn't see my bulging eyes popping with excitement. I barely listened, wondering more if Ray would eat his egg roll. But after I met Sam, I could see where she got her directness and tenacity. I had to say very little before Cecilia popped the real question, explaining that Samantha was also home, just having finished her sophomore year, and was in need of some company. Her mom asked me to take her daughter out some night this week. This is all rather confusing, I frowned. Perhaps I was too engrossed in my plate to follow who did what asking. Or I just stopped caring. Ray continued. I hesitated only long enough to observe public decorum, and then stumbled through my shock enough to arrange a pickup for this Friday night at their house. Mrs. Carlyle was ready with the calendar and all, as if she knew I would never turn down this invitation. The 3-year age gap was no longer an obstacle. In fact, 3 years was now about 10% of his life, an appealing mathematical relationship. Plus, if Samantha matured into half the woman Ray had extrapolated her to be from age 15, it would be a very enjoyable summer. Coupled with a suggestive and overly direct appeal from her mother, Ray could be married in no time, or at least he imagined he would be. For the worn skipping rock, it seemed the very water itself was rising up to envelop the rock in this potential last splash. My meal was nearing its end, and I needed to save a few bites to enjoy while I waited for Ray to at least eat. Placing the chopsticks down, I poured tea for each of us and sipped the hot refreshment before asking, Ray, what makes you so sure about this girl? You haven't seen her in years. Her mother arranged the date, and every date of yours ends in calamity. He started eating and pointed the chopsticks at me. That doesn't matter. This is it. It's gotta be Samantha. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. The alignment is happening, John. This was typical Ray. He could imagine a life before he met the wife. He bought presents for future birthdays without knowing the girl. He planned dates years ahead of finishing the first night. He spoke of children as a get-to-know-you activity, and he was hopelessly obstinate about hope. Everything about Ray's love life sickened me, though it provided hours of comic relief and fodder, or at least a nice background noise over late lunch. Had it occurred to you that you may want to speak to Samantha herself? Yes, of course, answered Ray, blushing in shame and irritation. No, it hadn't, I challenged while shaking my head. You find all of this so cosmically correct in your delusional state that you've forgotten Samantha's part. Who knows if she wants to see you? Maybe she's concealing a lover from her apparently invasive mother, or perhaps worse. Retorts and counterpoints continued over the meal, though I finished eating long before Ray. Finally, the fortune cookies arrived with the check. Jupiter moved into position as Ray read his fortune. Someone from your past has returned to steal your heart. I could not compose better mawkish smut to shower Ray with unnecessary hope. As if he was not altogether already lost, here was his prophetic and admittedly spooky reassurance. Ray's eyes widened as tiny gears calculated the significance of this cheap after-lunch dessert. This is it, John. Even the cookies agree. Friday, here I come. Such was Ray's nature. The stone bounced and splashed as if projected by field artillery, each girl the harbinger of hope, inkwell of poetry, and fountain of love, and ultimate disaster. Ray's first date with Samantha had gone well, apparently, And so had dates 2, 3, and 4. At least this is what I surmised when Ray brought Samantha along to the next week's rendition of Woes with Ray and John over traditional Americanized Chinese food. But there were no woes this week. Ray had switched into smitten love puppy mode. I considered watching the latest horror movie before sleep just to rattle his heightened endorphins. I arrived ahead of Ray at the restaurant, expecting a blubbering tale of how the evening with her had erupted in flames or how she had not returned any calls. Instead, I was shocked to see Aphrodite and her trailing minion. "John, I'd like to introduce you to Samantha Carlyle," stuttered Ray, as if introducing royalty. Despite my ingrained etiquette, my eyes started at the floor. She demanded her minions grovel first. I was greeted with dangerously high black heels worn to accentuate her svelte form. Long, nude legs rose to the table's edge. My eyes kept climbing, hoping to reach her eyes fast enough to not be considered chauvinistic or rude. There was no hope, and she knew it. Samantha wore tight royal blue dress shorts, mid-thigh length, proper for any occasion. I tried to reach the top. Faster, please, faster! But her beauty was remarkable, cold and classy like an untouchable icon. Viewing the icon was a gift only she bestowed. I took in her full figure. A loose blue blouse matched the shorts, held together as if by air. Those bold blues accentuated the dark, flat red lipstick painting her closed lips. She knew how to frown. Samantha was disinterested and disparaging. Her very cells exuded contempt. I made it to her eyes and almost wished I had kept mine down. Submission stammered on the subconscious level. Her features were sharp and precise to match her clothes. Long nose, straight dirty blonde hair, and long bangs designed to flick and tease. Her eyes never locked with mine. They looked past me, above me, or maybe through me. Men were slaves, lucky to stare and serve. She deigned to accept your presence, a constant burden she dealt with silently. Ray fawned over this Amazon machine. I wanted to tame it. I tried to shake off the awe while scooting out of the grimy booth to stand for the introduction. I thankfully formed my words faster than another painful pause could ruin the moment or ensure total enslavement. I would not be conquered. "Nice to meet you, Sam." I extended my hand as I used the familiar nickname to rein back on Loverboy's oblivious deification. I forced cool confidence despite Samantha's stunning presence. She controlled the room without a word. "My name is Samantha," she dismissed scornfully. "Of course it is." I would not be sitting again until she commanded, either with word or action. The room was mostly empty, but the very walls stared at this exchange. "Well, my name is John, and I am Ray's irreverent sleeper." Again I tried to keep my cool posterior against this elegant machine. She had not yet looked at me, and I was still naive enough to believe she would crack. I sneaked a pathetic glance again to size up this whole creature, this perfect specimen. She hadn't noticed, or simply not acknowledged my up and down gaze. Instead, she reeled on Ray, the poor soul. "You brought me to meet your sleeper? On our 5th date? You said we were meeting your best friend." They had 4 dates in the last week? Something strange was afoot. Who was the hunted in this matchmaking? "And to this establishment?" Her backside was equally breathtaking. Blue worked wonders against her hair's caramel undertones. Every inch of her was electrified and ready to strike. I watched in wonder, happy to take in the show. Samantha continued as Ray shrunk and groped for an appropriate response, nearly stumbling into the next table. "I do not expect you to ever meet my sleeper. It is a lifestyle for me, a job for them. I feel enough of their presence in my sleep. I have no need for their presence while awake." I stared in simultaneous shock at her rudeness and admiration for her beauty and poise in the face of Ray. Girls may not have fallen for Ray, but no one treated him in such a manner. I loved it. This was even better than General Tso's chicken. I remained silent, intently wondering how Ray would react. He couldn't make eye contact with her, but found a neutral zone at the belly button. He then finally managed to find the words, and pleaded my case with pacifying tones. "Samantha, He's more than my sleeper. He's like my brother. We were raised together and have attended the same school forever. His family has slept for my family since the birth of Sleep Free. We're family." "Then you might as well have lunch with him," she said disdainfully, tilting her head back and dropping her eyes so that they shot down her long nose. "I find my sleepers through the market and discard them to avoid attachment. Distance is the better policy. You might consider the same given your irregular attraction." With that shocking offense, she gave me one savage look over her shoulder, catching me clearly gawking, before turning back to Ray. "I need to be going. Pick me up tomorrow night at 8. Ray attempted to intervene on my behalf. "Samantha, wait." "Sam," I interrupted with deliberate force to save Ray from his humiliation. "It was a pleasure meeting you." I reached to shake her hand, brushing her arm in the process, but she pulled away in disgust. "I can't wait for our next lunch." Still without acknowledging me, she addressed Ray. "Goodbye. See you tomorrow." Then, as if to reinforce her control and declare my non-existence, she kissed Ray on the cheek before exiting. Her blouse flapped as even the air parted for her. I had never met someone so archetypically cold. She was a wonder and a seductress. I couldn't wait to see her again. "Isn't she wonderful, John?" questioned Ray rhetorically with a dazed sigh as he settled into his seat. "So remarkably strong and beautiful and proper. I have definitely found the one this time." The one might as well have been the 100th for the number of times I had witnessed Ray lost in romance, but I treasured this moment of sheer oblivion and denial. Ray had clearly not endured the same lunch spectacle as I. "Yes, she's quite the girl," I admitted, without enumerating her peculiarities. Samantha was wonderful, but not in the love-struck way Ray imagined. She was female incarnate, and Ray was her prey. Ray laid out the last week moment by moment since picking Samantha up for their first date. It was a tale of beauty and voluntary enslavement. My chicken vanished long before this tale was finished.